Why should Saudi Arabia be trusted to conduct a fair and impartial investigation when they're accused of the disappearance and apparent murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
So we're all going to get to see the work product. We're all going to get to see the response that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia takes with this. When we see that, we'll get a chance to determine, all of us will get a chance to make a determination with respect to the credibility and the work that went into that.
That's my exchange with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, outside the White House really just about an hour and a half ago after he spoke with the president about his recent trip to Saudi Arabia and Turkey, saying that Saudi Arabia, quote, assured me they will conduct a complete and thorough investigation and that the report will be, as he described it, transparent. But Pompeo says the U.S. should give the Saudis more time, despite the fact the intelligence community is increasingly certain that the Saudi crown prince is behind Jamal Khashoggi's death. Meantime, just moments later, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin announced he will not be participating in the Future Investment Initiative in Saudi Arabia next week. It's a big conference that begins on Monday. Joining me now is MSNBC senior national security analyst Michael Leiter, the former director of National the National Counterterrorism Center. It shouldn't be so tricky to say, but it's a meaningful position. And it's why we brought you in to talk about this. So in simple terms, give us a sense, Mike, of what does 3 days do? They said we need 3 more days here. Don't we know what we need to know, or do we need 3 more days to let more investigation?
Well, I think we probably do have everything we need to make the decision, but this is a complicated enough political scenario, intelligence issue with both Turkey and Saudi Arabia, 2 key regional allies. So I think those 3 days really do 3 things. One, it does allow the intelligence community to potentially get hands-on information that they may not yet have.
So what type of let me interrupt you. But
video and audio from the Turks.
So you don't think we have that yet, likely?
I think it is very possible the Turks have described that to us, but we haven't seen it. So that's piece 1. It may help the intelligence community. Piece 2, this is a tricky line for the Trump administration to walk, and they, I think, need that time to calibrate the need to have good strategic relations with Saudi Arabia and what they do in this instance. And last, the Saudis clearly need time to get a story straight. It started with he left the consulate, we don't know what happened to him, to, well, maybe something went wrong. These were trial balloons. They've all been shot down because they didn't hold water, and clearly the Saudis want more time.
It looked like the president was among those sort of floating these trial balloons. He was the one who introduced to the world, whether or not he was the one who thought it up first or the Saudi king or prince initiated the conversation about these rogue killers here. What do you make of the White House's response in the immediate aftermath of this?
Well, I think it was rather Trumpian. The idea of rogue killers, I think to everyone who knows and has worked with the Saudis for some time, knows that that's pretty laughable. There's nothing rogue about this team coming out of Saudi Arabia. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has great control over these security services. It was one of the first things he did when he came into power. So rogue is simply not believable.
Is there any circumstance under which something like this, if it's the murder that we presume that it was, could take place without the knowledge of the Crown Prince?
In my view, if the Saudis did it, which I think it looks that way, there is no likelihood. Maybe he didn't know all the details, but absolutely, in my view, the Crown Prince would have been involved in that.
This wouldn't be the first U.S. administration that has put a strategic relationship among some moral dealings as it relates to Saudi Arabia. President Obama, George W. Bush have all had relationships that people have been critical of in terms of Saudi Arabia here. But let me play what we heard from Mike Pompeo just a short time ago in terms of that relationship.
I think it's important for us all to remember, too, we have a long, since 1932, a long strategic relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. They continue to be an important counterterrorism partner. They have custody of the 2 holy sites. They are an important strategic alliance of the United States, and we need to be mindful of that as well.
It's clear the president does not want to disrupt that relationship, even if the $110 billion deal may never come to fruition, isn't yet real. Some of it was done under President Obama. It's obviously the president's concern is less about one individual, perhaps, and about, as he describes it, the 500,000 jobs that would be affected by this deal that is yet to come to full fruition.
I'm not sure the president fully appreciates all the aspects of the relationship, but I think what Secretary of State Pompeo said was largely right. This is an important relationship, and we've had ups and downs in Democratic and Republican administrations, and it is important. What he left out was, I do think that the administration, the president's approach to all-powerful leaders who don't respect human rights has provided a window for this sort of behavior by Saudi Arabia. And that's something, regardless of the strategic relationship in Saudi Arabia, we have to address strategically across the globe.
The president said there will be severe punishment if we determine they're responsible for his disappearance and his death. What should the U.S. do to retaliate if that's found out to be the case?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's only going to be up to the president. As we saw with Russian sanctions, I expect Congress will play a very heavy hand in this.
So they may force his hand, but what should the president unilaterally do as best he can?
I would say certainly put those arms deals on a pause. I would suspend some intelligence relationships. Frankly, I don't think Saudi Arabia is as important on counterterrorism as they were 10 years ago. Still important on Iran, but not on issues, on some other issues. And then we potentially make some other limitations on Saudi engagement with international institutions that we make very clear this sort of behavior is not permissible by any country.
In the conversations I've had with people that are close to this White House, they tell me that basically the thinking is there have been a lot of issues with Saudi Arabia. For heaven's sakes, the Crown Prince locked up a bunch of, I think, members of his own family, for heaven's sakes. And the bottom line is those washed over. Is this the calculus here, that this thing will wash away like all the others have?
I think not only is it to some extent the calculus, it is likely to be right. As horrendous as that is, in my view.
What does that say about America?
Well, this goes back to our strategic approach to countries and prioritization of human rights. Doesn't mean it's the only consideration, but looking past that entirely, whether it's in North Korea or complementing dictators elsewhere, it is deeply problematic.
It's a challenge. It's a challenging decision for everybody as they're debating this around the country right now. It's good to see you in person.
Good to be here, Peter.
Thanks so much.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.